Good morning, everyone. We are going to wait a few minutes to allow some people to log in. It doesn't look like anybody's logged in yet to our webinar, so we're going to get officially started in the afternoon at 12:01. So we're going to start in 2 minutes. All right, as people are just joining us, we're going to get started in another minute. Happy Friday to everybody. Happy almost end of June. We're getting there. And excited to talk about accessibility services today. All right, Sherry, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kick us off today.
Hello, families and parents. We're so happy to see you here on this Friday. Sherry and Sherry are here. I'm Sherry Ibrahimi. I'm Director of Conference Services and Housing Administration here at Emory. I'm also working in the role as interim Director of Parent Programs and Family Programs for this summer, and we're so happy you're here. Today is going to be great. We're working with our Office of Department of Accessibility Services, which in my normal role in housing is one of my absolute favorite campus partners that we work very closely with. I'll turn it over to the other Sherry.
Yeah, this is also, we're really excited, our first crossover Family Friday webinar where we have invited both Atlanta and Oxford new families to join us. So really excited for that. And this information applies to students wherever you start at Emory because DAS is such an important central service that supports students across the university. And so with that, welcome to our Oxford families as well as our Atlanta families. And we're going to turn it over now to Sarah Marchetti, who's going to get started and talk about today's topic.
Perfect. Thank you, Sherry and Sherry. Happy Friday, as we mentioned. So my name is Sarah Marchetti. I'm an accommodation specialist with the department. So I work with all first and second year students. So that's Atlanta and the Oxford campuses. We also have Ethan Magnus. So Ethan is going to be monitoring the Q&A. And so Ethan is the other accommodation specialist within our department, and he works with third and fourth year and graduate students. And so we can talk a little bit about the agenda for today. So what do we want to cover? So we're going to talk about the accommodations request process. So how do you register? Where do you find that information? And then kind of what to expect after your student registers with our office. Okay, so the accommodations request process. In order to initiate accommodations at Emory, students have to reach out to our office. So they have to self-identify as a student with a disability. They'll complete the registration form. I'll show you where to find that a little bit further on. And then we'll collect documentation, review it. What we're considering when a student applies for accommodations is this a qualified student with a disability? So what does that mean? Is this a student who has a substantial life impact in one or more areas? So this is pretty similar to probably a qualification process that your child may have gone through with a 504 plan or with an IEP. And then, so after we establish that, then we're looking at what are the barriers, whether those are barriers in housing, dining, academics, that's what we're going to be considering. And then after we get all that information, review that documentation, we schedule an intake meeting to talk about the accommodation plan, talk about steps for implementing the plan. And then all students who are registered with our office get assigned a student access coordinator with our, we call it SAS team. which is student access services. And so this is kind of our support team, and I have a whole slide dedicated to talking about them a little bit further on. Okay, so how do you register with our office? So I'm going to talk about our website a few times during our presentation today, but the easiest way is just to go to our website and go to accessibility.emory.edu. This screenshot over on the right just shows you where exactly you can find that registration form. So if you click on that Students tab at the top and then navigate down to where it says New to DAS, you'll see it says Start the registration process and register here. So that's basically like a Google form to complete and fill out. You have to submit documentation at the same time you complete the registration form. I like to mention that because I don't want someone to do the whole form and then get to the bottom and see that there's, oh, I gotta have my documentation ready. And you'll see that the deadline to guarantee that academic accommodations can be put in place by 8/23 being first day of class, is July 1st. And so that's just because we have such an influx of registrations that happen within these few weeks. And sometimes we need additional documentation, additional information. So students are going to continue to register with us obviously after July 1st. And, more than likely we could potentially accommodate anything after July 1st. It just kind of really depends on how many registrations we get. So I do recommend if your student is thinking about registering, just go ahead and get that form completed within the next week or so. And then after, sorry.
Go back.
One more thing at the bottom. Thank you. So welcome sessions begin August 1st for students with approved accommodations. And so I'll talk about that a little bit further too. Thank you. Okay, so documentation. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because this is where we tend to get a lot of questions. So documentation, these are the must-haves we have to have with documentation. It has to be signed by the appropriate professional. So it has to be a professional who is qualified to give the diagnosis that they're signing off on. It needs to include information about disability history and the actual diagnosis. It needs to include a description of the current impact, especially impact as related specifically to the educational environment. And it needs to, again, be submitted with the registration form, just kind of hammering that one home. Documentation could be an evaluation. So it could be a psychological evaluation, a neuropsych. It could be a detailed doctor report. And then it could be an individualized education plan, an IEP, or a 504 plan. Sometimes, just depending on the specific IEP or 504 plan, we might need some additional information. The quality of a 504 or IEP kind of varies a lot by district to district, state to state. So sometimes we need more information with those. And so this is a common question we get. We don't currently have specific requirements for age of documentation. So the less apparent the disability, the more current information we may require. So if it's, let's say, a mental health diagnosis that could fluctuate a lot, especially within 6 months to a year, more than likely we're going to need more updated information within the last, say, 6 months. If it's a permanent disability that was diagnosed when someone was really young, potentially you could submit, an older evaluation or audiogram, things like that, and we may be able to work with that. But we do have some verification forms I'm going to talk about in the next slide that could be submitted in conjunction with whatever evaluation you have, and typically that should be sufficient enough. And then in some instances, we could potentially do a provisional approval. So provisional approval means that we could approve accommodation plans for maybe like 1 semester, pending receipt of updated documentation. So we don't like to do that too often because a lot of times students will submit and then, or they'll forget, and then those accommodations are going to expire when you go into the next semester. But there are some instances we could do that. Let's say if a student's doctor won't complete documentation without an in-person meeting. And so maybe they could do that at some point during a break, and then we can complete the plan. And so I always say, just submit what you have and we can review it, and then we'll just let you know if we need more information. So this is just a screenshot from our website. We really like to emphasize these forms that are available because we know sometimes it's not always very accessible to get an updated evaluation depending on the resources that are available. So you can navigate to our website. Again, it's accessibility.emory.edu. The student section, and again, it's that New to DAS, and then over on that right-hand side, there's a few different drop downs, but you'll see a forms drop down. So we have a housing accommodation request form that we put at the top because when it comes to housing accommodations, we typically need this form specifically because most things like psychoeducational evaluations, IEPs. They're not going to speak to a student's specific limitations that occur within housing, which is information we would need to know. And then underneath that, you'll see the specific verification form. So student can select which verification form, applies to them and their diagnosis. Okay, so after the students completed all that registration, they completed the form, they submitted the documentation, what to expect after that. So monitor Emory email. This part's really important. I know incoming students aren't fully used to monitoring their Emory email probably as much as the email they've been using, but all the communications from our department are going to come through the Emory email. So these are some of the emails they could get from us. So we might need more information or documentation. Again, this is going to occur pretty frequently with housing specifically. They could get an email indicating approval of an accommodation request. So every student will not be required to do an intake meeting. So if your child has, let's say, very simple accommodation requests for potentially extended time for testing or testing in a distraction reduced setting, and they've used accommodations since middle school, high school, they're pretty familiar. In that case, that we may approve the accommodation plan and send them over to our student access services team for support for the next steps. And then the vast majority of students who register with our office are going to get an email to schedule their intake meeting. So they'll get a link from us to a bookings calendar where they can schedule their intake. And during those intakes, students are going to need to be ready to talk about their diagnosis, talk about the barriers that they've experienced. And if approved, we're going to go ahead and finalize a plan during that meeting. And then I just like to mention this now because we've received so many requests within the past few weeks. It could take several weeks before receiving that request to schedule the intake during busy times. Okay, so this is a really important slide about the shift to student responsibility. So this is a big shift for incoming students in terms of just accommodations. Parents, I'm sure you know and you're well aware that you've had to kind of lead the charge for your child in securing accommodations and getting them doctor's appointments, evaluations, everything during their educational career. As they shift to the post-secondary setting, there's going to be a responsibility on the student to initiate the process to notify instructors of their accommodations every single semester. So they have to do a letter request process. And I know, Sherry, you could probably speak to this a little bit with your experience too. Okay, yeah, I can keep going a little bit more. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in.
Oh yeah, I would say this is a big thing. And actually at the end of this slide, I'll chime in kind of where we see challenges with students, especially, and them taking the lead. So finish this and I'll chime in. Perfect,
yeah. So like I said, with this process, they have to request an accommodation letter every single semester. And then they have to talk with their instructors about how the accommodations will be implemented. So that's really a two-step process. So for a lot of students, they think, okay, I requested my letter, that gets sent electronically to my instructors, I'm done, I'm good. But because of the way that accommodations are going to be implemented, there has to be a conversation. How are we going to do these testing accommodations? How are you going to communicate with us if you need an extension on a deadline, things like that. And then it's also going to be the student's responsibility to reach out to us when support is needed. So even though there's this shift to student responsibility, it's not like students are completely on their own. We have this whole team that supports students when they need it, but we can't, help a student work out an issue with the faculty member if they haven't reached out to us to let us know that something's going on. And then importantly, accommodations are not retroactive. So if a student forgets to request that letter until halfway through the semester, we can't go back and apply accommodations, to some tests, and we can't add extended time to anything that's been done.
So, Sarah, this is so helpful. And I kind of want to reiterate from the academic side where we see challenges with students, especially as they're new and kind of transitioning to becoming that college student. The biggest is that request for accommodation letter every single semester. And so Sherry, the other Sherry and I probably get calls several times a year and parents say, yeah, we set up accommodations for our students last summer, we're good. And later we find out that the student never actually requested their letters. And so it is not an automatic one and done thing that you are doing now. We are starting the process, and by we, really your student is starting the process, and this was very subtle, but Sarah did say when your student submits that registration form. So this is another instance where really your student should be submitting the registration form, not you. Or if you're there helping them, that's wonderful, but it really needs to come from them. So that's the first thing. Doing this at the beginning, registering at the beginning is the beginning of this process. It is not one and done. The second, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that conversation with each instructor. And so what I have found with some students is either they get really nervous and think, oh, I don't know, they got the letter, that's good enough. But in college, there are going to be lots of different types of classes, some small ones, some big ones, some with very specific test times, some with rolling assignments. And so they will have to have those conversations with each faculty member. The really important thing to know here, especially around attendance, is that Emory University in the college doesn't have a universal attendance policy. So that means that every single individual professor makes their own attendance policy. And if your student has attendance accommodations, that'll be really important to negotiate and discuss at the beginning instead of afterwards where there's a problem. I love, Sarah, that you add on here reaching out to DAS when more support is needed, because as we know, things change, especially being in a new college environment. We see things pop up that maybe your student tackled something and made through and was using all their resources. And you're like, wow, they haven't acted that way since 9th grade, but we're in a new place. And so if things change, if things pop up, if a medical condition flares up, which hasn't flared up in 5 years, all of that's possible. But we're not mind readers, and Sarah's offices are not mind readers. So really making sure that they advocate for themselves. And then the last thing, that accommodations are not retroactive. I think I see this a lot, especially when the registration process is maybe started but not completed. And so even when they're in process, that doesn't mean that accommodations are in place. You have to really finish that entire registration process and then make sure you've activated the accommodations for that semester. So I know I just repeated everything that Sarah said, but these are things that we see on the academic side that really hold students back instead of allowing them to flourish and move forward when they really have accommodations at their fingertips, or they could have had those accommodations at their fingertips.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know from that academic side. And especially, I don't know if I emphasize this, but the reason that the accommodation letter has to be requested every semester is because the notification about the letter only goes out to the instructors for the current semester. And so that's why they have to restart that process, each semester.
And as a reminder, professors change every semester, right?
Yes,
So
yeah.
versus in high school where sometimes their classes or, might have been the same teacher all year. Very rare, you're never going to take the same class 2 semesters in a row. So you're always going to have a new crop of professors and classes. Again, different attendance policies, different testing or assignment policies, all of those change every semester.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Oops,
Okay. Yeah. So here's a little bit about our student access services team that I've mentioned before. So this is our team that's completely dedicated really just to supporting students who have approved accommodations. A lot of students forget that they have their student access coordinator available. And so we're trying to really, really emphasize that, that this is their person that they can go to for any questions, for any issues, if they have issues with the portal where they request the letter, if they have an instructor who maybe doesn't fully understand an accommodation, this is who they can go to. And so on our website too, this information is on there. And so in the student section, if you scroll all the way down, it says meet the student access services team. And so the student access coordinators are assigned by last name, except for a couple that are for School of Nursing or Oxford School of Law. And so Shatanya does cover all of Oxford for any of our parents joining from Oxford. So students can schedule their welcome sessions with their assigned student access coordinator beginning August 1st. And so during that welcome session, what they'll do is they'll go over that portal where they request the letter. So for students who do better with a visual demonstration, doing the welcome session is a really good idea. After I meet with students, I'm also going to send instructions for how they can request the letter so they can choose if they want to just follow the instructions and do it, or if they want to meet with their coordinator. But a lot of students sound like they want to meet with their coordinator, and I think it's a great idea just to kind of go over that process.
Sarah, can you confirm or clarify if the August 1st sessions are then remote, they're online?
Yes, yes. So those are remote sessions, yes. And
Okay,
it's best for students to do those with the laptop, because I do have a few students who will join meetings via phone. And so being able to see the portal on the laptop is going to be the best way to do those meetings.
and you might talk about this later, but once they come to campus, are there opportunities for students to meet with Shatanya or others in person? And how do those appointments get made?
Yeah, so there certainly could be. We found that most students want to schedule virtually. A few different reasons for that, because we work with students on both campuses, this gives more availability to meet with someone, and also just to maintain confidentiality. A lot of students choose to do these meetings virtually so they can be in the privacy of, their room or a study room or, wherever they may be. But you can also reach out to any of your student access coordinators directly too and talk with them about options. So here are some of the common missteps that we have seen when it comes to issues that might pop up with students with accommodations. So the first one being the delay of disclosure. So a lot of times, a student has used, let's just use the time and a half example again, but has used time and a half throughout high school. Maybe they didn't use it for every test. And so they come into college and they're thinking, oh, I'm not really sure that I need this. I'm just going to try it without it. So they don't register with our office, and then they take a couple tests and they don't do well at all because they actually did need that extended time. So that's an issue that we see quite a lot. And a lot of times we also see students who come and register with us at the very end of the semester leading into finals. Maybe there's a course that they're not doing well in and they feel that okay, I need to get my accommodations now. Well, we have reasonable timeframes for implementation for accommodations. And so instructors, it's not reasonable for an instructor to have to implement a new accommodation like the week before finals. So this is an issue that, we see quite a bit. And then stigma, I think we all probably know that there can be some cultural stigma that exists around disability. And I think students who are 18 in that developmental age kind of want to fit in. They don't want to stand out from their peers. And so they might not register for that reason. And then I mentioned temporary conditions here because most people just don't know that our office works with students who have a temporary condition that needs accommodations. So it wouldn't be appropriate for a student, let's say, who just had absences because they have the flu or something. That wouldn't be a need for an accommodation. But if a student had a concussion, a broken leg, a broken arm, and then they're returning to class and they might need help with note taking or that extended time or whatever it might be, that's when they can register with our office. And then lastly, accommodations do not always equal success. So that's kind of a big shift because accommodations in high school are really meant for success. And accommodations at the post-secondary level are meant for access. And so we do have a lot of, campus partners who have resources that are available for success, academic support, coaching and tutoring and things like that. But having an accommodation does not mean we're going to ace a class.
Sarah, I'd love to kind of come in similarly and talk a little bit about how we see this in real life too, especially on the academic side. This delay of disclosure or I just want to try it, I think I cannot emphasize enough how big of a misstep this can be. And so we would much rather have students who have had any history of using accommodations, have the full support net available from the beginning, and then ease off or taper off later, then go cold turkey and try it out at the beginning and have to climb out of a hole later in the semester. So think of this as that support network set up for success from the very beginning, get everything set up. And if students think, great, now I don't need it, I've tried it out and I'm doing okay, wonderful, that's fine. But as Sarah mentioned, waiting till the end of the semester or waiting and failing a few times forward and then going, well, now I need the help. It's just an unnecessary extra stressor, I think, when they're already dealing with a lot transitioning to college.
Absolutely.
Sarah also mentioned we have so many campus partners that are available for success. I love that Emory's approach to academic success is that it's not academic support, it's academic success. And we really, I think, follow kind of a universal design method where we have services available to all of our students, which is amazing. And so we've tried to take away the stigma of using these support services, that they really are just success services, that all students at any level can access them do use them and we know help them succeed, because time management looks different in college than it did in high school for any student. Tutoring is something maybe students were the tutors in high school, but they need some extra support because we're asking application questions instead of rote memory. So it's available, it's included in tuition. We talk about it in our resource class that we give all students in the fall semester. So we just hope that everybody takes advantage of that early, so that they're not climbing out of those holes mid-semester later. And if something happens, right, and they do need to kind of climb out, that's okay too. It really is okay. It's a learning process. And we know that your students are learning how to be college students.
Yes, absolutely.
This is just another example of empowering your student to sort of be the one in charge. I know as parents, and I know I fall into this category with my kid, I've been the advocate for the accommodations they need, because I have a child with disabilities. And so this is just one of those transitions to remind them, now that they're here on campus, it's time for them to sort of take over advocating for what they want. And, honestly, we couldn't have better campus partners than Sarah and Ethan. The staff is so friendly. They work here because they're excited to work with college students, and they're a great resource.
I also wanted to give a shout out to our faculty, who are really amazing as well. And sometimes there's this kind of thought, faculty are at a level that they wouldn't understand or they don't know. One, faculty are people too. Many of them have been here many years and have worked with lots of students with different challenges or needs or other things as well. So this is not new to our faculty. Many of them have their own students and families, kind of like as Sherry has shared as well. And so this shouldn't be a surprise to faculty. And what we have heard from students is like, wow, talking to my professor was actually much easier than I thought. So we really want to empower them to do that. I will also say what I love about students who have accommodations is that they're usually some of our best self-advocates coming to campus, because they have been learning and practicing that throughout their high school years. And so going to office hours early before there's a problem, just to introduce themselves, already gives them a leg up, so that if something comes up down the road, and maybe it's not even accommodations related, it's something else, they're already comfortable reaching out, asking for a meeting and saying, hey, here's what I need as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I can talk a little bit about transition to accommodations, what you can do now to prepare and help your child prepare. So just have your student initiate that registration process as soon as possible. Plan for a continuum of care, so if your student is seeing a therapist virtually, are they going to be able to do that with the state laws as they transition to Georgia? Are you going to need to plan things around breaks, things like that? And again, support student advocacy. We talk about that a lot, and I'll continue to talk about that, but that's a big one. And then consult DAS with your students. So if you have a specific question and you're reaching out to our office, preferably your student is reaching out to our office with the question. That's, our preference. But if you have something that you would like to ask, so at least CC your student on the communication so that they're getting that, information, and their involvement in the process is critical. Okay, so helping your student adults. So here's some messages to enforce.
It's our favorite part of the whole webinar, Sarah. The Sherry Show.
Yes. So some messages to enforce. So this is, I kind of wrote these from the perspective of you, talking to your child. So reminding them that they're their own best advocate. So you have helped them secure accommodations, you've helped them get testing, evaluations, all of that. But they also have the unique experience of knowing, what is this actually like for me? And so just reminding them that you're the only one who really knows what your disability is like and what barriers you face. Reminding your student it's your responsibility to initiate that process to notify instructors again of the approved accommodations every single semester. So you can always check in, those first couple semesters. And then here are some questions you can ask your student. Are you able to describe the functional limitations of your disability to DAS staff? because those are the questions that we're going to answer during the intake. We want to hear directly from the student about the impact and what they experience. And then ask them, are you ready and comfortable talking to your instructors about what your accommodations are? Because that's a big one, as Sherry already pointed out. So. Okay.
I love these so much. And so one other thing I might suggest is if your student at all is feeling nervous about this, maybe role play this a little bit and just say, what would that conversation look like? It doesn't have to also be the whole story, right? So asking for help, especially when talking to faculty or others, is kind of the elevator pitch of here's what I think I need and here's what would work. The nice part is that DAS has all of the details. And so faculty don't actually need to know all of the details, but really being able for students to answer for themselves what support they need for that class is the best thing to practice ahead of time. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yes, completely agree. Okay, so in terms of self-advocacy, here are some questions that students should be prepared to answer. Now, the first question is a little bit of a trick question. So what is your disability? Students don't have to answer that question. So like Sherry mentioned, all the documentation, all that registration form, all of that information that was submitted at the beginning, that's all confidential. Faculty only have access to that approved accommodation letter that just lists the accommodations. However, someone could potentially ask them this question and they don't have to answer, but they could maybe talk about, I have limitations related to my processing. That's how they could answer that question. And then talk about when will you use this accommodation. So if there's a testing accommodation that you only need in certain subjects or for finals, like longer tests instead of quizzes. And how often, same thing. Will you need this for every test? And how will you communicate with your professor regarding a disability related absence, et cetera. So just thinking about some of those things ahead of time are all big parts of self-advocacy.
Yeah, and I do think I just want to go back to like, what is your disability? If a faculty or other people ask, they might be asking really genuinely out of how can I help you? And so that is one thing that they don't always know. Am I allowed to ask that or not? And students oftentimes just share a lot and they don't have to. So I don't know how to share that any more emphatically either. Like, it's okay not to share all those details. But that second question, how will you use that accommodation, is really important. Students need to be able to answer that much more than what is your disability.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then on this, I think this is maybe our last slide, but I wanted to include this. So Jane Jarrow is a leader really in the field of disability in higher education, but she's also a parent of a student with a disability. And so she wrote this letter, and I think because she has such a unique perspective that a lot of parents really enjoy like reading this letter and just kind of feeling seen and heard in that unique perspective. And so if you just even Google Jane Jarrow, Jane and then Jarrow, Jarrow, open letter, it should come right up. It's on a lot of different websites. A lot of colleges have posted this letter. And so I recommend reading that if you want to just kind of feel, like I said, seen and heard with your experience.
All right, that is the end of our official presentation. Big, huge thanks to Sarah for sharing all this really great information. And of course, to my co-host, Sherry, always a pleasure. We have one more webinar coming up in June, and this is called Transition of Care. And if you've joined us for any of the previous 3 sessions, this is really the session that brings the last 3 weeks together. So we will have representatives from student health, counseling, psychiatry, student case management, really talking about things that you can be doing this summer to get ready to transition that care to your student in the driver's seat. We will also reference back to this DAS presentation and some of the other ones as well. So we'd love for you to join us on the 30th. We are taking off for the 4th of July week, so no webinar on the 7th, but we'll pick back up in mid-July to talk about advising and registration. So we are going to stop recording right now.